Mason walked through the front door, carrying a suitcase in one hand and holding Vanessa's hand in the other, her pregnant belly visible beneath her coat, and he did not stop to think about what he was about to destroy. He believed, in that moment, that he had already won. He believed the hardest part was behind him, that whatever pain this caused would fade, that Claire would eventually accept it, because she always did. What Mason did not know, what he could not have known standing in that doorway with his mistress at his side, was that the woman waiting for him in the kitchen had already made her decision, and it was not the decision he expected. Mason thought he had won everything that mattered to him. He had no idea he had already lost it all. Claire stood by the kitchen counter, arms folded, her face unreadable, in a way that unsettled Mason more than screaming ever could have. She did not raise her voice. She did not throw anything, did not call Vanessa names, did not beg Mason to reconsider. She simply looked at the suitcase in his hand, looked at the woman carrying his child, and said nothing at all for almost 30 seconds. To Mason, that silence felt like relief. To anyone who truly knew Claire, that silence should have felt like a warning. Because Claire was not a woman who reacted in the moment. Claire was a woman who planned, and she had been planning for a very long time. What Mason believed was the end of his marriage was, in reality, the final scene of a much longer story that had been unfolding behind his back for over a year. Every quiet evening Claire spent working late at the kitchen table, every phone call she took in another room, every meeting she claimed was about the kids' school or the family accountant, had been leading to this exact night. She had known about Vanessa long before Mason ever brought her home. She had known about the affair while Mason still believed himself undetected, invisible, untouchable. And in that time, Claire had not simply grieved, she had prepared. Quietly, legally, methodically, she had rebuilt the foundation of their entire financial life without Mason ever noticing a single crack forming beneath his feet. Mason set the suitcase down near the stairs, still believing that the worst thing that could happen to him tonight was an argument, maybe a slammed door, maybe divorce papers within the week. He had already convinced himself he could handle that outcome. He had a good job, a solid income, a name people respected in this town. He assumed that whatever Claire took from the house, whatever she said to their friends, whatever version of this story she told, he would still walk away standing. He had built his entire sense of security on the belief that Claire would always be the one left with less. That belief was about to be proven catastrophically wrong, in ways Mason would not fully understand for weeks. Because Claire was not leaving empty-handed, and she was not leaving broken. Claire was leaving with a plan that had already been executed, signed, filed, and finalized. The accounts Mason assumed were shared were no longer shared, and the debts Mason assumed were split were no longer split. The safety net Mason had spent 15 years assuming would always be there, quietly managed by the woman he had just humiliated in her own kitchen, had already been rewritten in a way that placed every ounce of financial exposure squarely on his shoulders alone. Mason would not discover the full weight of what Claire had done until the first notice arrived in the mail. By then, it would already be far too late to undo any of it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next did not just end a marriage. It ended the version of Mason's life he thought was untouchable, and it revealed exactly how far a quiet, patient woman will go when she finally stops being underestimated. This is the story of Mason, Claire, and Vanessa, and how one man's arrogance blinded him to the one person who had been protecting him the entire time, right up until the moment he gave her every reason to stop. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further, because the answers are not what you expect. How does a woman who spent 18 years being seen as the quiet, agreeable wife end up holding every advantage the moment her husband finally reveals his betrayal? Why did Mason never once suspect that the woman managing his household finances for nearly 2 decades might be capable of using that same access against him? And what exactly did Claire do, in complete silence, over the course of a full year, that would leave Mason with nothing but debt while she walked away with everything that actually mattered? Keep watching, because the answer involves a level of patience and precision that most people, including Mason himself, would never have believed her capable of. To understand how a man could walk into his own home with another woman on his arm and still believe he held the upper hand, you have to understand who Mason believed himself to be. Mason was not a cruel man by nature, at least not in the way people usually imagine cruelty. He was charming, successful, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He ran a mid-sized construction and contracting business he had built from almost nothing, and by his mid-40s he had exactly the kind of life that made other men in town quietly envious. A large house, a reliable wife, 2 kids who were doing well in school, and a reputation as someone who always seemed to land on his feet. Mason had simply never been tested, and men who have never been tested tend to overestimate exactly how strong they actually are. Claire, on the other hand, had spent nearly 2 decades being underestimated, and not entirely by accident. She had a quiet way about her, a calmness that people often mistook for passivity. She had put her own accounting career on hold when their first child was born, and slowly, almost invisibly, she had become the true financial architect of their household. Mason signed the big checks and made the big decisions in public, but it was Claire who understood every account, every loan, every insurance policy, every legal document that held their life together. She had a degree in finance from before she ever met Mason, and she never let him forget how useful that degree had turned out to be, even as he rarely acknowledged it out loud. The 2 of them had met at a mutual friend's engagement party nearly 18 years earlier, back when Mason was still working for someone else's contracting company, and Claire was 3 years into an accounting job she genuinely enjoyed. Mason had been magnetic that night, funny in a way that made her forget to be cautious, and within 8 months they were engaged. Claire's parents had liked him immediately. Her older sister had been the only one who quietly wondered, out loud, whether Mason was the kind of man who wanted a partner or the kind of man who wanted an audience. Claire had laughed it off at the time. She would think about that conversation many times in the years that followed. For the first several years of their marriage, things were genuinely good. Mason worked long hours building his business, and Claire supported him in every way a partner could, handling the household finances so he could focus entirely on growth. When their first child arrived, followed 2 years later by their second, Claire made the decision to step back from her own career, not because Mason demanded it, but because it made logical sense at the time, and because Mason promised, repeatedly, that her sacrifice would never be forgotten. For a while, it wasn't. He thanked her often in those early years. He told people at dinner parties that she was the real reason his business survived its hardest seasons. Somewhere along the way, as the business grew larger and more profitable, those thank yous became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. Those early years were not without their own quiet struggles, the kind most young families experience but rarely discuss openly. There was a stretch, just after their second child was born, when Mason's business nearly collapsed under the weight of a job that went badly wrong, a client dispute that dragged on for months and drained nearly every dollar they had saved. Claire remembered those months clearly, not because they were dramatic, but because of how ordinary her role in surviving them had been. She renegotiated their mortgage terms herself. She found a way to defer 2 loan payments without damaging their credit. She quietly picked up freelance bookkeeping work for a neighbor's small business, income Mason barely noticed at the time because he was consumed with keeping his own company afloat. It was Claire's steady hand, more than Mason's ambition, that carried them through that first real crisis. By the time their children were both in elementary school, Mason's business had not just recovered, it had grown into something considerably larger than either of them had imagined in those difficult early years. He hired his first full crew of employees. He signed his first major commercial contract. He began appearing in small ways, in local news coverage about the town's growing development projects. Claire watched this transformation with genuine pride, believing that the partnership they had built together, one where she handled the unseen mechanics of their life while he handled the visible growth, was simply how a strong marriage was supposed to function. She did not yet understand that Mason had begun quietly rewriting the story of their success in his own mind, slowly recasting himself as the sole architect of everything they had built. What Claire did not know yet was that this quiet rewriting of the story would eventually cost her everything she believed was permanent. But not before it cost Mason far more. By the time Mason's company had grown into the largest contracting operation in the county, something in him had shifted in a way Claire could feel, but could not yet name. He began spending more time at the office long after his crews had gone home. He began attending industry conferences that somehow always required an extra night away. He began treating Claire's opinions on business matters, opinions she was more than qualified to give, as background noise rather than counsel. Claire told herself it was simply the pressure of success, that men sometimes changed when the stakes got higher, and that the man she married was still in there somewhere, just buried under stress and ambition. She would not be entirely wrong about that. She would simply be wrong about what he had chosen to bury himself in. Claire's older sister, a woman who lived 2 hours away and visited several times a year, noticed the shift long before Claire was willing to name it out loud. During one visit, roughly 2 years before the affair ever began, she mentioned over coffee that Mason seemed to look through Claire at family gatherings rather than at her. The way a person looks at furniture they have simply grown used to, rather than someone they still find genuinely interesting. Claire brushed the comment aside at the time, telling her sister that marriages naturally changed after nearly 2 decades, that the intensity people saw in movies was never meant to last forever, and that steady comfort mattered more than fleeting excitement. Her sister did not push the point further that day, though she would later admit she had not fully believed comfort was really what she was witnessing. It was around this same period that Mason began describing himself, both to friends and eventually to colleagues at industry events, as a man who had built everything entirely on his own, a phrase that quietly erased nearly 2 decades of Claire's labor, sitting beneath every success he now claimed as exclusively his own. He rarely mentioned that Claire had managed the books during the company's leanest early years, or that it was Claire who had negotiated the very first equipment loan, using her stronger credit history, at a time when his own credit was still recovering from mistakes made in his 20s. Mason had folded these facts into a private mythology in which his success belonged entirely to him, a mythology that would make it considerably easier, later, to justify everything that followed. Vanessa entered the picture through the most ordinary channel imaginable, which is often how these stories begin. She had been hired 18 months earlier as an office manager for Mason's growing company, 12 years younger than him, sharp, ambitious, and completely unfamiliar with the version of Mason that existed at home. To Vanessa, Mason was simply a confident, successful business owner who valued her work and made her feel seen in ways her previous employers never had. She did not know about the family dinners, the soccer games, the anniversary trips Claire had spent years planning, down to the smallest detail. She knew a version of Mason that Claire herself had not seen in years, a version that still made an effort, still complimented, still listened. What began as long conversations after hours about supply chains and scheduling slowly became conversations about everything else, the kind of conversations that quietly cross a line long before anyone admits it out loud. Mason would later tell himself, and eventually tell Vanessa, that nothing physical happened for the better part of a year, as though that distinction mattered to anyone but himself. Claire noticed the shift before either of them likely realized how far it had gone. She noticed the new energy in Mason when his phone lit up during dinner. She noticed the way he started dressing slightly differently for ordinary office days. She noticed, most of all, the growing distance between the man sitting across from her at the table and the man she had married nearly 2 decades earlier. Mason had no idea that the woman noticing every small change was already 3 steps ahead of him. He would not find that out until it was far too late. The turning point, the moment Mason would later describe to Vanessa as the night everything changed, happened during an industry conference roughly a year before he ever brought her home. What was supposed to be a routine 2-night trip for continuing education credits turned into something else entirely after a dinner that ran long and a bottle of wine that made the distance between professional admiration and something more personal feel smaller than it actually was. Mason told himself afterward that it had been a mistake, a single lapse in judgment he could quietly bury and never repeat. He believed that story for almost 3 weeks. Then Vanessa sent a text that made clear she did not see it as a mistake at all. And Mason, rather than ending things while it was still simple to do so, found himself unable to say no to the version of himself that existed only around her. Over the months that followed, Mason became increasingly skilled at the ordinary mechanics of deception, the kind that rarely involves grand lies but instead relies on dozens of small omissions stacked on top of each other. He stopped mentioning certain coworkers by name at home. He began taking calls in his truck rather than the house. He told Claire that certain out-of-town job walkthroughs required overnight stays that, in reality, lasted only a few hours. None of these lies were particularly sophisticated, and Mason would later admit, when pressed by his own attorney during the divorce, that he had never actually believed Claire was paying close enough attention to notice any of them. That assumption, more than any single lie, would end up being the most expensive miscalculation of his life. Vanessa, for her part, did not see herself as the villain in this unfolding story, and in many ways she genuinely was not. She had asked Mason directly, early on, whether his marriage was already over in every way that mattered, and Mason had told her exactly what she wanted to hear, that he and Claire had become little more than co-parents sharing a house, that the emotional connection had faded years earlier, that it was only a matter of time before he made things official. Vanessa believed him, largely because there was no reason not to. She had never met Claire. She had never seen the two of them together, outside of the version of Mason's home life he chose to describe. She was building a relationship on a story that was, at best, deeply exaggerated, and at worst, almost entirely untrue. The first concrete evidence came almost by accident, the way it so often does. Claire was reviewing a company credit card statement, something she still quietly managed, despite Mason's increasing insistence that she didn't need to bother with the business finances anymore. And she found a hotel charge in a city Mason had told her was purely a supplier meeting. On a weekend, he had told her he would be back by Sunday afternoon. She did not confront him that night. She did not confront him the next morning either. Instead, Claire did something that would define everything that happened afterward. She sat with the information, said absolutely nothing, and began paying much closer attention to every account, every statement, every document that touched their shared financial life. Over the following weeks, Claire uncovered more than she ever expected to find, not because Mason was particularly careless, but because he had never imagined Claire capable of looking this closely, or capable of understanding what she found, even if she did look. There were dinners charged to the company card that had nothing to do with clients. There were gift purchases that never arrived at the house. There was a second phone plan buried in the business expenses that Mason had never mentioned. Claire pieced together the affair almost entirely on her own, quietly, methodically, the same way she had built every spreadsheet and budget that had kept their household running for 18 years. But finding the affair was only the beginning. What Claire decided to do next would determine everything that happened over the following year. There was one evening, roughly 3 weeks into her quiet investigation, when Claire came dangerously close to confronting Mason directly. And it is worth pausing on that moment, because it says so much about the woman she was. She had found a hotel receipt from a city Mason claimed he had never visited, printed it out, and sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to sleep, waiting for him to come home. When his truck finally pulled into the driveway just after 11 that night, Claire folded the receipt, slid it into a drawer, and greeted him instead with a question about their son's upcoming school project. She would later tell her attorney that something in her, some instinct she could not fully explain at the time, told her that confronting him that night would only give him the chance to control the story before she fully understood it herself. That instinct turned out to be the single most important decision Claire made in this entire story, because in the weeks that followed, rather than allowing herself to be pulled into an emotional confrontation that Mason could deflect, minimize, or eventually spin into a narrative where she was the unreasonable, suspicious wife, Claire instead began quietly gathering evidence with the same discipline she brought to a year-end financial close. She kept a private folder of documents, receipts, statements, screenshots of phone bills, None of it accessed through anything resembling deception or hacking, simply the ordinary paperwork of a household finance manager who happened to notice inconsistencies no one else in the family was positioned to catch. And once she was certain, once there was no version of events left where she was simply being paranoid, Claire made a decision that would define the rest of this story. She decided she would not confront Mason with emotion. She would confront him with preparation. Claire's first call was not to a friend, not to her sister, and not to Mason. It was to a family law attorney 2 towns over, someone with no connection to their social circle, someone Mason would never think to ask about. In that first meeting, Claire laid out everything: the marriage, the business, the assets, the mortgage, the joint accounts, and the affair she was now certain was taking place. The attorney told her something that would quietly guide every decision Claire made over the following year. Something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with protection. In a marriage where one spouse controls the public financial narrative while the other quietly manages the details, the person managing the details holds far more power than anyone realizes, as long as they act before the other side even knows there's a fight happening at all. Over the following months, Claire began a slow, deliberate process of separating her financial exposure from Mason's without ever alerting him to what she was doing. She opened accounts in her name alone under the pretense of simplifying tax preparation, something Mason barely paid attention to since he considered that entirely her department anyway. She began redirecting a portion of her own part-time consulting income, work she had quietly resumed under Mason's nose, into accounts he did not know existed. She reviewed every loan document tied to the house and the business, discovering that several of them, thanks to decisions Mason had made years earlier to protect his own credit standing, were structured in ways that left Claire far less liable than he assumed. Mason had built those structures to protect himself. He had never imagined they would one day work against him instead. Claire's attorney had suggested, during one of their earliest meetings, that she consider bringing on a forensic accountant to formally trace the business finances, since Claire's own understanding, while sharp, was based on years of informal familiarity rather than official documentation. Claire agreed, and over several quiet sessions spread across 4 months, disguised on the calendar as ordinary tax planning appointments, the two of them built a complete picture of exactly how Mason's business and their personal finances intertwined. What they found surprised even Claire, who had assumed she already understood the full scope of their financial life. Mason had personally guaranteed far more business debt than she had ever realized. Debt that existed entirely separate from any joint marital assets. Debt that would remain his and his alone, regardless of how the divorce ultimately settled. There was a particular meeting, roughly 8 months before Mason ever brought Vanessa home, when Claire's attorney laid out 3 possible paths forward, each with different levels of risk and different timelines. The first path involved confronting Mason immediately and pursuing a fast, contentious divorce, one that would likely result in a messy fight over shared assets before either side had time to properly document anything. The second path involved simply waiting for Mason to make the decision to leave on his own, allowing his own actions to eventually create clear legal grounds. The third path, the one Claire ultimately chose, involved quietly and legally restructuring her own financial position over the course of a year or more. ensuring that whenever Mason did make his move, she would already be standing on solid ground, rather than scrambling to catch up. Claire chose the third path not out of vindictiveness, but out of a deep, practical understanding that the person who prepares first is rarely the person who suffers most. Part of that preparation involved a careful, almost invisible renegotiation of the mortgage on their family home. Roughly a year before the confrontation in the kitchen, Claire suggested to Mason that refinancing made sense, given falling interest rates, a suggestion Mason readily agreed to, since it appeared, on the surface, to simply save the family money each month. What Mason did not fully absorb, because he left the actual paperwork entirely to Claire, as he always did, was that the refinancing also restructured the ownership percentages on the property in a way that significantly favored Claire's position, a completely legal adjustment that Claire's attorney had recommended specifically with this eventual outcome in mind. Mason signed the documents at the kitchen table one evening, while distracted by a phone call from Vanessa, barely glancing at the pages Claire slid in front of him. He would not think about that signature again for almost a year. By the time he did, it would be one of the least surprising things he discovered. What made Claire's approach so devastating was not any single dramatic action, but the sheer volume of small, legal, unremarkable decisions that accumulated into something enormous. She spoke with the family accountant, someone Mason trusted completely and rarely questioned, and quietly began ensuring that her name was removed from newer liabilities the business had taken on, liabilities Mason had signed for personally, without fully realizing the implications. She encouraged Mason, gently, almost lovingly, to take on a large equipment loan for the business expansion he had been wanting for years, a loan that would ultimately sit entirely under his name and his personal guarantee. Mason saw this as Claire finally supporting his ambitions again. In reality, she was watching him build the very structure that would eventually collapse on him alone. Meanwhile, Mason's relationship with Vanessa continued to deepen, moving from something secretive into something he increasingly stopped bothering to hide well. He began telling himself the story that so many men in his position tell themselves, that Claire had grown distant first, that the marriage had been dying long before Vanessa ever arrived, that he deserved a version of happiness he felt he had lost somewhere along the way. He did not notice that Claire had grown quieter, not out of resignation, but out of calculation. He did not notice that the woman he assumed was simply enduring their marriage was, in fact, 3 steps ahead of him in a game he did not yet know they were playing. In the weeks before Mason finally decided to bring Vanessa home, he became briefly convinced that Claire already knew about the affair and was simply waiting for an opportunity to strike first, perhaps by draining shared accounts or hiring her own attorney to ambush him. He hired a private investigator, quietly, to follow Claire for 2 weeks, half expecting to uncover an affair of her own or evidence that she was hiding assets from him. The investigator found nothing, because there was nothing to find in that direction. Claire's days were exactly what they appeared to be: school pickups, grocery runs, quiet evenings at the kitchen table. What the investigator could not see, because it was not the kind of activity that looked suspicious from the outside, was the steady, legal, almost invisible work Claire had already been doing in plain sight for nearly a year. Mason called off the investigation, reassured that Claire was simply the same predictable woman she had always been, a conclusion that would turn out to be the most dangerous misjudgment of his entire life. Mason had just spent thousands of dollars confirming the one thing that would give him false confidence at exactly the wrong moment. When Vanessa discovered she was pregnant, Mason experienced something close to panic for the first time in years. Panic that had nothing to do with Claire and everything to do with the practical reality of his double life becoming impossible to sustain. He made the decision, somewhat impulsively for a man who prided himself on careful planning in business, to finally end things with Claire and build a new life with Vanessa openly. He convinced himself the transition would be difficult but manageable, that Claire would take the house or a settlement, that he would keep the business, that life would reorganize itself around him the way it always had. He did not consult a lawyer of his own. He did not review the actual structure of their finances. He simply assumed that being the primary income earner meant he would remain in control of the outcome. This assumption would become the single most costly mistake of his life. The night Mason brought Vanessa home was not, as he believed, an act of finally taking control of his own story. It was the final piece Claire had been waiting for, the moment that would allow her to file for divorce with absolute moral and legal clarity, on terms she had already spent over a year quietly arranging. Claire's calm that night was not shock. It was relief, the particular relief of someone who had been carrying an enormous weight in silence and could finally set it down. She let Mason and Vanessa stand there, waiting for an explosion that never came, because Claire understood something Mason did not yet grasp. The real consequences were not going to happen tonight, in the kitchen, in front of a suitcase. They were going to happen slowly, over the following months, in certified letters and legal filings and phone calls from banks Mason had trusted his entire adult life. Their daughter, 16 at the time, was upstairs when it happened, and later described hearing the front door and coming halfway down the stairs before freezing at the sight of her father standing beside a stranger who was visibly pregnant. Their younger son, only 14, had been at a friend's house that evening, a small mercy Claire had quietly arranged weeks earlier, once she suspected something might come to a head soon. Claire would later say that protecting the exact moment her children learned the truth, choosing carefully how and when they found out, rather than letting them witness it firsthand in that kitchen, was one of the only decisions in this entire ordeal driven purely by emotion rather than strategy. Even in the middle of her own quiet devastation, Claire was already thinking several steps ahead. In the days immediately following that night, Claire sat her children down separately, choosing her words with the same deliberate care she had applied to nearly everything else over the past year. She did not villainize their father in front of them, even though every part of her had every right to. She simply told them the truth, in the gentlest version available, that their father had made choices that were going to change their family, that none of it was their fault, and that she would handle everything else so they could focus on being kids for as long as that was still possible. Her son, quieter than his sister, did not ask many questions that first week. Her daughter asked nearly everything at once, and Claire answered what she could, without ever letting her own hurt spill over onto her children's understanding of their father. Within a week, Claire filed for divorce through the attorney she had already been working with for over a year, presenting documentation so thorough and so clearly organized that Mason's own lawyer, hired hastily and reluctantly, admitted privately that there was very little room to maneuver. The financial separation Claire had engineered meant that the majority of shared marital assets, the ones Mason assumed would be split evenly, were legally hers alone, or protected under agreements he had signed without reading closely years earlier. Meanwhile, the business loans, the equipment financing, the expanded credit line Mason had personally guaranteed just months before bringing Vanessa home, remained entirely his responsibility. Mason had spent a year building the very foundation that would soon come crashing down around him, and he had done it willingly, believing every step was his own idea. The first real blow came almost exactly 3 weeks after that night in the kitchen, when Mason received a notice from the bank regarding the equipment loan he had taken out for the business expansion. Because Claire's name had already been quietly removed from the account months earlier, and because the loan had always required his personal guarantee, the full weight of the debt sat entirely on his shoulders. Mason assumed this was simply an administrative issue, something his accountant could clarify quickly. Instead, his accountant explained, somewhat uncomfortably, that Claire had been the one managing most of these restructurings over the past year, always with his verbal approval, always framed as routine business housekeeping. Mason had signed nearly every document himself. He simply had never read them as closely as Claire had written them. That single notice was only the first of many. What Mason would discover over the following weeks would be far worse. Mason's attorney requested an initial settlement conference roughly 6 weeks into the proceedings, hoping to negotiate a faster, less public resolution before the case attracted more attention in a town where everyone seemed to already know some version of the story. Claire arrived at that conference with a binder nearly 2 inches thick. Every account statement, every loan document, every refinancing agreement organized by date and clearly labeled, a level of preparation that visibly unsettled Mason the moment he saw it laid out on the table. His own attorney, flipping through pages he was seeing for the first time alongside his client, asked for a short recess less than 20 minutes into the meeting, a request that told Mason everything he needed to know about how this negotiation was likely to unfold. The settlement conference stretched across 3 separate sessions over the following 2 months, each one narrowing Mason's options a little further. Claire never raised her voice during any of these meetings, never resorted to accusations about Vanessa or the pregnancy, and her attorney later remarked that this restraint made her position even more difficult to argue against, since there was no emotional volatility for Mason's side to point to, only a long, calm trail of legally sound documentation. By the final session, Mason's attorney privately advised him that continuing to fight the settlement in open court would likely cost him significantly more in legal fees than simply accepting the terms Claire had proposed, terms that were, in truth, already deeply favorable to her, given how the underlying finances had been structured over the preceding year. Mason sat in his accountant's office for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, going through document after document, each one bearing his own signature, each one dated months earlier, each one representing a decision he barely remembered making with the level of attention it clearly deserved. He kept asking the same question in different ways, unable to fully process the answer each time it was given to him. How could he have signed so much away without realizing it? His accountant, a man who had worked with Mason for over a decade, finally told him something plainly, without any attempt to soften it. He had never once seen a client review important financial documents as quickly as Mason did, always trusting that someone else, usually Claire, had already checked the details. For 18 years, that trust had been well placed. Mason had simply never considered what would happen the day it stopped being mutual. The following weeks brought a steady stream of additional discoveries, each one smaller than the last, but collectively devastating in their accumulation. A second business line of credit, opened the previous spring for what Mason remembered as inventory purposes, turned out to carry a far higher interest rate than he recalled agreeing to, a rate that had been clearly disclosed in paperwork he had signed, without reading, during a particularly hectic week, juggling 3 active job sites. A life insurance policy Mason had assumed named Claire, and the children equally had, in fact, been updated 11 months earlier to reflect a far more favorable arrangement for Claire specifically, an update Mason had approved over the phone during a conversation he barely remembered having. None of these were secrets Claire had hidden. They were simply details Mason had never bothered to verify, buried in the ordinary paperwork of a marriage he assumed would never require this kind of scrutiny. As the divorce proceedings continued, more of Claire's careful preparation came into focus, each new revelation landing like a fresh wave Mason had not braced for. The joint savings account he assumed still held the bulk of their emergency funds had been steadily drawn down over the previous year, entirely legally, into an account solely in Claire's name, funds she was legally entitled to as her own separate property under the structure she and her attorney had established. The house, which Mason assumed would simply be sold and split, was revealed to be held under a refinancing arrangement Claire had quietly pursued 18 months earlier, one that placed Claire in a significantly stronger position of ownership than Mason had ever realized, thanks to a series of decisions he had approved without asking enough questions at the time. Mason's attorney, reviewing the mounting documentation, told him something that would haunt him for months afterward. Every single decision Claire had made was legal, documented, and, in most cases, made with Mason's own signature attached to it somewhere along the way. There was no fraud to contest, no hidden scheme to expose, because Claire had never needed to hide anything. She had simply used the access and trust Mason had given her for 18 years, access he had granted willingly because he never imagined it would ever be used against him, to methodically position herself for exactly the outcome that was now unfolding. Mason had spent so many years assuming that being the one who earned the money meant he controlled where it went. He was only now discovering how deeply wrong that assumption had been. One discovery in particular struck Mason harder than the rest, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Buried among the documents was a small, separate retirement account Claire had opened for herself nearly 3 years earlier, funded entirely through her own bookkeeping income, an account Mason had genuinely never known existed because he had never once asked what Claire did with the modest earnings from work he considered a hobby rather than a career. The account was small compared to the larger sums moving through the divorce, but it represented something Mason found difficult to sit with, proof that Claire had been quietly building a version of financial independence for herself long before she ever suspected the affair, simply because she had always understood, in a way Mason never had, that relying entirely on one person's income and one person's decisions was its own kind of risk. Mason also learned, during this same stretch of discovery, that Claire had spent several months consulting with a business valuation specialist to understand exactly what his company was worth, and more importantly, what portion of that value was tied to contracts and goodwill that could evaporate quickly if his reputation suffered, versus tangible equipment and property that would hold value regardless. This valuation had informed nearly every decision she made about which assets to prioritize protecting and which liabilities she could safely allow to remain in Mason's name alone. Mason's own attorney admitted, somewhat begrudgingly, that the analysis was more sophisticated than anything his own side had prepared, and that it explained with uncomfortable clarity why Claire's settlement demands had been so precisely calibrated from the very beginning. Vanessa, for her part, had entered this relationship believing she was stepping into a life of stability and comfort, the natural next chapter for a successful, established man. As the divorce dragged on and Mason's financial reality became increasingly public within their small town, she found herself confronting a version of Mason she had never seen before. A man suddenly anxious about money, suddenly short-tempered, suddenly far less certain of himself than the confident business owner who had first caught her attention. The child was born during the height of the financial fallout, and instead of the celebratory new beginning Mason had imagined, the birth arrived in the middle of legal filings, mounting debt notices, and a business that was quietly beginning to lose contracts as word spread through the tight-knit local industry about Mason's unraveling situation. The family accountant, a man who had known both Mason and Claire since the earliest days of the business, found himself in an uncomfortable position during this period, caught between a decades-long professional relationship with Mason and a quiet respect for what Claire had accomplished, without ever asking him to cross any ethical line on her behalf. Everything Claire had done, she had done through her own diligence and through conversations that never once asked him to hide anything from Mason or falsify a single record. He would later admit to a colleague that he had never seen a client so completely outmaneuvered by his own trust in someone else, and that the entire situation had taught him more about the real mechanics of financial power in a marriage than 2 decades of handling divorces ever had. Word does travel quickly in a town where everyone in the trades knows everyone else, and Mason's reputation, the very thing that had built his business in the first place, began working against him for the first time in his career. Clients who had once trusted him without question started asking uncomfortable questions about the company's financial stability, particularly after a supplier mentioned, in passing, that Mason's business had fallen behind on payments for the first time in over a decade. Mason found himself in the deeply uncomfortable position of defending his professional reputation at the exact same moment he was defending his personal, 1-2 fires burning simultaneously, both fueled by decisions he had made in a matter of months rather than years. One of Mason's longest-standing clients, a regional developer he had worked with for nearly 9 years, quietly pulled a mid-sized commercial project after hearing rumors about the divorce and the equipment loan default from a mutual supplier at an industry trade breakfast. The developer never mentioned the affair directly when he called Mason to explain the decision, framing it instead entirely around timeline concerns and bonding capacity. But Mason understood exactly what was actually happening. In a small business built on relationships, the moment people begin quietly wondering whether you are stable, whether you can be counted on to finish what you start, they stop calling, and they rarely tell you why. 2 more mid-sized contracts fell away over the following 2 months, in almost identical fashion, each loss compounding the financial pressure Mason was already struggling under. Mason tried, for a while, to project the same confidence publicly that had always defined him, showing up to job sites early, attending the same community events he always had, telling anyone who asked that everything with the business was simply going through a normal seasonal adjustment. But the crews who worked under him noticed the change, even if his clients were too polite to say so directly. Paychecks that had always arrived like clockwork began occasionally sliding a day or two late. Material orders that once happened without hesitation now required Mason to personally negotiate extended payment terms with suppliers who had known him for years. The confident business owner who had built a reputation on never missing a deadline or a payment was, for the first time in his career, learning what it felt like to be the person everyone quietly worried about, instead of the person everyone trusted. Inside the business itself, the strain began showing up in smaller, quieter ways, long before any client noticed. Mason's longtime crew foreman, a man who had worked for him since the company's earliest days, began fielding an increasing number of questions from workers about paycheck timing, questions the foreman had never once had to answer in over a decade of steady, predictable operations. He never confronted Mason directly about it, out of loyalty more than anything else, but he did quietly begin updating his own resume, a decision he would act on within the year, once it became clear the company's troubles were not going to resolve themselves quickly. Losing a foreman of that experience and tenure would end up costing Mason far more than the salary he had been paying him, since institutional knowledge like that rarely transfers easily to whoever steps in afterward. Claire, meanwhile, moved through this period with a composure that unsettled everyone who witnessed it, including her own attorney, who had handled plenty of difficult divorces but rarely seen a client so entirely unmoved by chaos she had, in many ways, engineered. She was not cruel about it. She never gloated, never confronted Mason publicly, never used their children as leverage or weapons the way so many bitter divorces devolve into. She simply executed the plan she had built over the previous year, with the same quiet discipline she had once used to manage their household budget, and let the natural, legal consequences of Mason's own decisions unfold exactly as they were always going to unfold, once he chose to bring Vanessa into that kitchen. During the mediation sessions that took place in the final months before the divorce was finalized, Mason attempted, on more than one occasion, to appeal to the 18 years he and Claire had shared, hoping that some residual goodwill might soften the financial terms being finalized. Claire listened to these appeals politely, without cruelty, but also without wavering. She would later tell her attorney privately that she had grieved the marriage long before Mason ever brought Vanessa home, that the grieving had happened quietly over months of discovering the affair, and that by the time mediation began, she was no longer negotiating with the man she had married. She was negotiating with the reality of what remained, a reality Mason had shaped through his own choices long before Claire ever needed to shape anything herself. There was one moment during mediation that Claire's attorney would remember for years afterward, when Mason's own lawyer attempted to argue that Claire had acted in bad faith by restructuring finances without informing Mason directly of her intentions. Claire's attorney responded simply that nothing Claire had done violated any law or any agreement between them, and that a spouse choosing to protect herself using entirely legal means after discovering infidelity could hardly be called bad faith by any reasonable standard. The judge overseeing the proceedings, a woman who had seen countless divorces built on far messier foundations, noted in her own remarks that the documentation Claire's team had provided was among the most thorough she had encountered, and that Mason's own signatures across every document made his objections difficult to sustain on any practical or legal basis. By the time the divorce was finalized, roughly 7 months after that night, Mason's financial situation had deteriorated far beyond what he ever imagined possible for a man who, less than a year earlier, had been considered one of the more successful business owners in the county. The equipment loan, combined with the expanded credit line and a business that was steadily losing contracts, had pushed him to the edge of bankruptcy. He kept the business technically, but the business itself was now a shell of what it had been, its reputation damaged, its cash flow strained, its future far less certain than it had ever been under Claire's quiet, invisible management. Mason had spent so many years believing Claire was the passive partner in their marriage. He was only now understanding how much of his success had actually depended on decisions she had made behind the scenes, decisions he had simply taken credit for, without ever questioning how they got made. In the months following the divorce, Mason attempted several times to reconnect with his children on the terms he had grown used to, expecting the same easy access and unquestioned authority he had always held as their father. His daughter, now old enough to understand far more of what had happened than Mason perhaps realized, grew noticeably more guarded around him, answering his calls less frequently and keeping their visits shorter than he would have liked. His son, younger and less openly resistant, still went along with scheduled visits, but Claire noticed a new quietness in him afterward each time, a withdrawal that worried her more than any argument could have. She never discouraged the children from seeing their father, believing firmly that his relationship with them was his own responsibility to maintain or lose. But she also made no effort to smooth over the natural consequences of his choices on their part either. Mason, for his part, found himself increasingly isolated during this period, his business struggling, his social circle quietly thinning, as some of his and Claire's mutual friends found themselves choosing sides without ever being asked to. A few of his closest friends remained loyal, at least on the surface, but even they grew visibly uncomfortable whenever the subject of his divorce came up, offering vague sympathy rather than the wholehearted validation Mason seemed to be searching for. He had spent so many years being the center of every room he entered, and now, for the first time, he found himself on the outside of conversations, watching people exchange glances he was no longer entirely welcome to interpret. One friend in particular, who had known Mason since before the business even existed, finally told him plainly during a difficult conversation that no one had forced him to bring Vanessa home that night, that no one had forced him to sign the equipment loan, and that blaming Claire for the consequences of his own choices was beginning to sound less like grief and more like an unwillingness to grow from any of it. Mason did not speak to him again for several weeks after that conversation. The final and most painful twist arrived roughly a year after Mason brought Vanessa home, when Vanessa herself made the decision to leave. The life she had imagined, the stability, the comfort, the confident partner she believed she was building a family with, had instead become a smaller apartment, mounting bills, and a man consumed by anxiety and resentment he increasingly struggled to hide. Vanessa took their child and moved back closer to her own family, leaving Mason not with the new beginning he had once imagined, but with an empty apartment, a struggling business, and a level of isolation he had never experienced in his entire adult life. In the weeks before she left, Vanessa had tried, more than once, to talk with Mason about the growing financial strain, only to find herself met with a defensiveness and irritability that reminded her less and less of the confident man who had once made her feel valued at the office. She began to notice, with growing discomfort, that Mason spoke about Claire constantly, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of disbelief that never seemed to fade, as though he was still trying to solve a puzzle he could not fully understand. Vanessa realized, somewhere in those final months, that she had built a relationship with a version of Mason that no longer existed, if it had ever truly existed at all, outside of the specific circumstances that had first brought them together. When she finally packed her own bags and left, she did so quietly, without the dramatic confrontation Mason had once imagined delivering to Claire. There was, in the end, a certain symmetry to it that Mason himself would later admit he found almost unbearable to sit with. The woman he had risked everything for was gone. The woman he had underestimated for 18 years was thriving without him, and Mason was left, for the first time, to sit entirely alone with the consequences of every decision he had made. Claire, in the months that followed, rebuilt her life with a steadiness that surprised even the people who knew her best. She returned to accounting work full-time, this time under her own name, for her own clients, building a small but respected practice of her own, in the same town where Mason's reputation continued to quietly decline. Her first clients came largely through word of mouth, other women in town who had heard fragments of her story and wanted precisely the kind of careful, detail-oriented financial guidance Claire had quietly provided her own family for nearly 2 decades. Within 2 years, her practice had grown steadily enough that she was able to hire a part-time assistant of her own, something she found herself smiling about privately, given how many years she had spent managing someone else's growing business instead of her own. She raised their children with a stability that never wavered, never leaning on bitterness, never speaking poorly of their father in front of them, simply modeling for them, day after day, what it looked like to face betrayal with intelligence, rather than rage. Her daughter, in particular, would later tell a family friend that watching her mother rebuild so calmly during those years taught her more about strength than any conversation ever could have. Claire never sat the children down for a dramatic explanation of everything that had happened. She simply continued showing up every single day, exactly as steady as she always had been, and let her actions speak in a way that required no explanation at all. People in town began to speak of Claire differently over time, no longer as Mason's quiet, supportive wife, but as a woman who had, in the most legal and understated way imaginable, protected herself completely when the person who was supposed to protect her chose not to. Even Mason's own mother, in a rare moment of honesty during a strained holiday visit, admitted to a close friend that she had underestimated Claire for years, always assuming her son had married the more capable partner. She had simply misjudged, as so many people had, which one of them the word capable actually described. Vanessa, in the years that followed her departure, rebuilt her own life closer to her family, raising their child largely on her own, with occasional, increasingly distant involvement from Mason, whose support obligations became yet another line item in a financial life that never seemed to stabilize the way he once assumed it always would. She would later describe the entire experience to a close friend as a hard but necessary lesson in recognizing the difference between a man who is confident because he has earned that confidence and a man who is confident because he has simply never faced a moment that required anything else from him. She did not regret her child for a single day, but she regretted, deeply, how long it had taken her to see the difference between those two kinds of confidence in the man she had once believed she was building a future with. Claire's daughter eventually left for college on a partial academic scholarship, choosing a program in finance, a decision she attributed directly to watching her mother navigate impossibly difficult circumstances with nothing but intelligence and patience. Her son, still finding his own path through his later teenage years, remained closer to home, working part-time for one of the very contractors who had once been a competitor of his father's business, quietly building a reputation of his own that owed far more to his mother's steady example than to anything he had learned watching his father during those final difficult years. Both children, in their own ways, carried forward the same lesson Claire had lived out in front of them, without ever needing to explain it directly. That quiet preparation will always outlast loud confidence in the moments that matter most. What makes this story linger long after the details fade is not simply the betrayal itself, because affairs happen and marriages end, and none of that alone would have made this story worth telling. What makes it linger is the quiet, devastating power of a person who is consistently underestimated, and what happens when that person finally decides to stop being underestimated on someone else's terms. Mason spent nearly 2 decades assuming that control over money meant control over outcomes. That being the one who signed the checks meant he would always be the one left standing. Claire understood something far more important, something Mason never took the time to learn. Real financial power often has very little to do with how much money passes through your hands, and everything to do with how closely you understand where it actually goes. There is a particular kind of arrogance that grows quietly inside successful people, a belief that success in one area of life guarantees competence in every other area as well. Mason had genuinely built something impressive with his business, and that success convinced him he understood risk better than anyone around him, including his own wife. He mistook Claire's quiet, steady management of their household for a lack of ambition or intelligence, when in reality, it was simply a different kind of skill, one that operated without an audience, without recognition, and without the need to be constantly validated. It is worth asking how many marriages, how many partnerships, quietly rest on exactly this same imbalance. One partner assuming their visible contribution is inherently more valuable than the invisible labor holding everything else together. Claire's story also raises an uncomfortable question that many people watching this will have to sit with honestly. At what point does quiet preparation in the face of betrayal cross from self-protection into something closer to calculated retribution? Claire's attorney would argue, and the courts ultimately agreed, that every single decision she made was both legal and reasonable given the circumstances she was facing. But there is no denying that Claire chose, deliberately, to let Mason keep building the very structure that would eventually collapse on him, rather than warning him the moment she first suspected something was wrong. Whether that decision reflects wisdom or something colder, is likely to depend entirely on which side of that kitchen counter you imagine yourself standing on. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you directly. If you were in Claire's position, discovering the affair long before the confrontation ever happened, would you have done exactly what she did, quietly preparing for over a year before ever letting him know you knew? Or would you have confronted him the moment you found that first hotel charge, even without a plan in place? Let us know in the comments, and if this story affected you the way it affected so many of our other viewers, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like Mason and Claire's are exactly what this channel is built around. Real situations, real consequences, and the quiet moments of preparation that change everything long before anyone else even realizes the fight has already begun. In the end, Mason did not lose everything because Claire took it from him through anger or revenge. He lost it because he spent 18 years assuming a woman who managed every detail of his life would never fully understand the power those details actually held. He learned, far too late, that being underestimated is not a weakness. In the right hands, at the right moment, it is one of the most powerful positions a person can hold. Claire never raised her voice that night in the kitchen. She did not need to. She had already won, long before Mason ever walked through that door, and the only thing left for him to discover was exactly how much he had lost, one certified letter at a time. If you found yourself holding your breath during any part of Mason and Claire's story, let us know which moment hit you hardest, whether it was the silence in that kitchen, the quiet discovery of the hotel charge, or the moment Mason finally understood the full weight of what he had signed away without ever realizing it. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the one paying the closest attention, and subscribe for more real stories about the moments that change everything, long before anyone sees them coming.